All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are live. I was a serious, devout follower of Christianity. I mean, I was all obsessed and consumed with it for many years. It had impacted me deeply. And so, oops, what the heck is this? Is this a commercial? I had a commercial pop up on my screen. I really dug deep into this whole thing and really had a personal relationship with Jesus. And every word was true. It impacted me, and I just didn't know what I know now. And I know many Christians who will tune in, who are going to pay attention, maybe, fingers crossed, they'll watch the channel if they dare, might be taking notes today, and I hope you are, because we're going to take an examination into the prophecies with our good friend Jonathan Pierce. But before we do, I want to go ahead and introduce you guys to my intro I made for him, and then we're going to get into the book, which I highly recommend everybody get a hold of. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. The resurrection of Jesus. Did this historically happen the way it's described within the Gospels? Are they trustworthy? Well, we're going to dive into that, but today is a focus on the prophecies that surround the Easter story, the resurrection. We don't get into the post-resurrection too much here. We're just focusing on that pretty much death and such. And today I have author Jonathan M.S. Pierce. He's an author of many books. This is the one we're going into right now. Highly recommended. I've got like I'm color coding everything, and it's just all sorts of stuff going on here. Every page that I see a nugget where I'm like, oh man, the way you word things is very black and white. It's not gray. It's you mean what you say, and it makes perfect sense. So highly recommend everybody get the book. Welcome to MythVision, my friend.
Thank you. It's good to be back. It's really looking forward to it. The book, I wanted to have that kind of clarity that I think is necessary for the layman. So you're reading this and you're like, I completely understand what's being said. I'm not being crowded out by too much jargon and by too much complex sort of academic phraseology and whatnot. It's hopefully clear, pretty concise, as much as it can be for such a huge topic, and brings into play things like philosophy and obviously theology, as well as just a kind of bare bones history to the whole like narrative.
So anybody who's interested, in the description, you guys see my MythVision recommended books. This is in that list of books. I've got countless books if you're interested in shopping and checking out some of the material that I've recommended. It's in there. This is the one we're going through right now. This is our third episode in this topic. You're not going to want to miss this one. This one's very interesting. We're going to talk about the prophecy surrounding the death of Jesus in the Easter narrative, but also Joseph of Arimathea. And I think that's another funny, interesting character. He also has a blog down in the description. You guys can subscribe and follow what he's putting out there. He is also a philosopher. So if you want to hear good reasons why his epistemology leads him to an atheistic worldview and why he thinks it's concrete, you might want to check him out and dive deeper, because I'm going to have some discussions on this channel between him and others who are theist, Christian, potentially people who are Muslim, etc. And then also, last of all, MythVision's Patreon. I already dropped multiple videos yesterday. I've got 5 or 6 right now I'm working on that I'll be launching on Patreon again soon. All of these are going to be on Patreon, eventually find their way to the public. Now, real quick, before we get started, you sent me some other books here. The Nativity. We're going to end up getting into the Nativity at some point. It's an easy read. It's not a really big book. Really interesting one.
It's what happens when
Metamorphosis.
it's what happens when it's only in 2 gospels, right?
Yeah, exactly. This one's a little bit thicker, but it still looks like an easier read. Easy read, Metamorphosis. And then The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View. And oh no,
so that's Aaron Adair. So
that's your friend.
He popped up on one of your videos recently with Richard Carey and Dennis McDonald, he asked a question, and I just got in contact with you to say he's written a book on the Star of Bethlehem, and it's the go-to book on the Star of Bethlehem. So when we do the Nativity, that would be nice to tie that in if you have a chat with him.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely going to do that. Give me some time. For those of you who are asking about the t-shirts that I've had, I have a Teespring. I'm an idiot when it comes to knowing how to run it. So I do have there's a clothing store downtown, and it's a local business that has really comfortable t-shirts that will be able to make them. I'm thinking about getting a link set up with them and putting that in the description. So you guys, if you want to like rock the merch, if you will, the apparel of MythVision, hats, whatever, they can have that there. You can order it and on demand, then they can create it and they'll mail it to you. So just give me, I'd say a week or so. I'll try and figure something out with that, because there's some really cool stuff. I think the logo is pretty neat, and everyone can rock that "We Are MythVision." So,
and the great thing is, Derek, is same with my books, right? Don't mind if you don't wear the t-shirt or don't read the book, but as long as you buy 7 of them, right? Just that's the important thing.
I don't mind. Look, I don't push it. It's not something that I, push it, but it'd be awesome to have some people sending me pictures in the email saying, I'm rocking your shirt. People are asking me, what does that mean? And you can have these conversations. I'm looking at the myths. That's what this is all about. So let's take it. Let's get into this, right? The chapter title is Prophecies, Scrambling Back in Time to Prove the Present. So do me a favor. Go ahead and take us into this. I
think what's worth remembering is what we talked about previously. And the main thing is, or 2 main things. One is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And hopefully we showed that's a maxim that works, that is practically true for all of us every day. If someone tells you something that's absolutely crazy, then you're going to require more evidence to believe what they say. And when that applies just as much to the Gospels, if they're going to present really crazy claims, we need really good evidence to support a rational belief in those claims. So then the question is, are the Gospels really good evidence? And we've talked about this already, that essentially they're not. But not only are they not good evidence in kind of their historiography, but they also internally contradict each other. And are problematic. So that's something to remember. And also, we're dealing with theology, not history. So Christians will approach the Gospels as gospel truth, right? And they will look at it as this is just history. This factually happened, and not only that, it happened 100%. Well, 100% of it happened, and there's no argument about that. But it's clearly not history. It's clearly theology. And we talked last time about how, for example, one good example of this is John disagrees with the synoptic gospels about the time when Jesus was crucified, and also what happened on the cross, like about having his legs not broken, right? Why is that? Because he's presenting Jesus as the Paschal Lamb. So he is literally, as well as metaphorically, this is the Paschal Lamb that is now replacing that. This is how the Eucharist comes to replace what the Jews would have previously done as far as having a sacrificial meal. So it's hugely theological, and that's why he's saying slightly different things to the synoptic gospels, because he has a different theology to present. Mm-hmm. So we're dealing with theology, not history. So those two points I think are important to reestablish.
Yeah, I've just recently interviewed M. David Litwell, which will be on my Patreon, and the book he wrote was How the Gospels Became History. And he talked about how, I can't remember the exact guy who wrote How to Write History, and he goes into these different examples. And the way you did a lot of times is you would write with the mythoi. He didn't like using the word myth or mythology because it carries some baggage of like not true or whatever. But it's like mythoi, and that they would include, like, in their story, which is not actually true. They would add historical detail, and oftentimes they get it wrong. And this you find in Luke, like I can't remember, it's a whole decade off of the date of a certain supposed historical event, but he's off by a decade. And they would do this and place these narratives into these times in which there's some verisimilitude to history. But what you talk about in this chapter, specifically when it comes to the resurrection, it is, I mean, yeah, they're adding Pontius Pilate, right? This is a guy that we know, this guy's around. They're adding Herod. We know this guy's around. But they're doing things with some characters, which we'll get to Joseph of Arimathea, that you're like, this guy is highly, highly suspicious.
So that there's a couple of things to say to that. So one, you know, you look at Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle, he included real places and real people in his stories about Sherlock Holmes, right? But that doesn't mean the stories about Sherlock Holmes are true. And this is what people do with Luke. They say Luke's a marvelous historian. Look, he mentions real places that exist and real people who exist. And you're like, yeah, but that doesn't prove at all that what he says is historically true. Mm-hmm. So that's a real big problem. And as you say, like in the Nativity book, there's the issue of the census, Luke's census happening, and Matthew's reliance on Herod. But Herod died 10 years before Luke's Quirinius census. So how do you reconcile those two things? That's a historical problem. And, you know, obviously that's a completely different subject, but it brings into play this issue that you have with just merely mentioning real events or things doesn't mean it's true, because actually even those mentions can be historically problematic.
Look, I had fun reading this chapter. I might as well start with one of my green sticky notes right out the gate, because I've been doing it color-coded. Red is the first video we did. White is the next video, and I've got all the white tabs and now green, so I don't get confused here. And right out the gate, you say something like this. This is exactly what you say. Right out the gate, let me say this. If Jesus really had prophesied his death, now everyone listening, I want you to just think common sense with us for a second here. This seems to be like anyone who has isn't in this to just be right about their beliefs should try to take this critical approach with us. You can conclude what you want. You can say, hey, you could do just like this guy right here. Christ is risen, he says. He believes Christ is risen. Well, I can't disprove to you that didn't happen. I can also not prove it did. But take a critical approach with us here for a second. Let's analyze this. You say, all right, if Jesus really had prophesied his death and resurrection, like the Gospels present him as doing in his life, running around saying, I'm going to be killed, I'm going to be risen, etc.
And the Old Testament scriptures as well, yeah.
Yeah, the way that they grab, right. So there'd be no reason for them to see. Says there would have been an awful lot of people at the tomb waiting for him, and no one would have been surprised at his death or his resurrection. But there was no one waiting for him. Some women were coming to anoint his body, but nobody was waiting. And everyone was surprised to the point that hardly anyone initially believed it. This guy's sitting here saying this the whole time.
Yeah, so this, I think this is a hugely important point that people don't often talk about. I like, this is very rarely mentioned, which is a point that if there were clear prophecies of what happened to Jesus, why were people not ready for this? Why was this a surprise? Why is it that it all looks like just a bunch of Old Testament scriptures that were ad hoc thrown at Jesus to try and validate what he did, rather than proper prophecies? And this happened, you know, in the Nativity as well. So when you have the Magi going to Jerusalem and walking around saying, we're looking for the new king, and Herod goes, okay, come on, what's this all about? And they say, well, we're following a star, so we think something crazy is going to happen. And Herod sends his scribes off to look at the scriptures. They come back and say, oh, it turns out there is a prophecy and the Messiah is due to be born in Bethlehem. Hang on, why did it take scribes to go back and trawl through some old scriptures to finally find this out? Why is this not common knowledge? So if this was truly a prophecy that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem, everyone should know it. Everyone should be moving to Bethlehem, because their chance of their kid being the Messiah is going to be, odds on, or at least they've got a chance of that happening. something, but no one knows about this. And he has to send his scribes away to come back and say, oh, it turns out there is a prophecy. Well, it's clearly not an obvious prophecy if you have to go back and trawl through the scriptures to find out something that may be construed as a prophecy. And it might be that the Messiah is being born in Bethlehem. So you apply that exactly to these resurrection claims, and you've got the same scenario, which is you've got a bunch of really dodgy so-called prophecies, because they're not prophecies, they're cherry-picked verses from non-prophetic contexts, and you're throwing them at Jesus. That's what it looks like. It doesn't look like clear prophecies, because otherwise, if they were clear prophecies, people would know that this was going to happen.
There's so many issues that you point out in just these two chapters on the prophecies and Joseph of Arimathea, that anyone who's looking at this without already believing in the testimony of your church, or you're already just presuppositionally accepting this either from a subjective experience or whatever it might be, you look at this, you're going to have a problem. You're going to run into some problems. And you talk about how the prophecies that are being used in their initial context have zilch to do with what's actually going on in the New Testament. But then they want to do the double whammy, right? Oh, well, it's a double fulfillment. And, you know, what the, it's funny because if it's a double fulfillment, why do they only pick the part they like, and they exclude the double fulfillment before and after that supposed prophecy? It's
so we'll come on to that. But before we come on to that, I think it's worth talking about the philosophical problems with prophecy straight off the bat. So if you have, say, for example, a 600-year-old text prophesying that Jesus is going to come down and die and be resurrected and atone for people's sins. So you've got this 600-year gap that says this thing predicts this thing. Now, in order for that to be the case, you are going to have humans going along and sinning, and this world that's it's just not going to be any other way. In other words, there's nothing humanity can do, because we have a prophecy that Jesus is going to 100% come down and do this kind of stuff. So you're having to accept that there's nothing that humans can do other than sin in order to require atonement for those sins. So that's an interesting point straight away. But also, in order to say that this is going to happen and this person's going to be there and these people are going to cast lots and this is going to happen, you are going to have to set out the world in such a way that you have something that looks like theological determinism, which is to say that God has to micromanage the world in order for these prophecies to come true. And you're going to have this scenario where God is saying, well, Mary can't fall off a wall that she is walking along and break her legs and die or get bitten by a snake. You can't have this happening. You can't have that happening. This world has to work in such a way that we have this scenario going on 600 years later or 400 years later or whatever. And I think there's an awful lot of philosophical problem with prophecy. But it's also made worse by the fact that it's a weird set of priorities God has. So God seems to think it's more important that some soldiers cast lots for Jesus's clothes, his bloody clothes, to fulfill a prophecy. God has arranged the world in such a way than to eradicate malaria or a global pandemic, or to stop a tsunami killing 240,000 people. It's just a weird set of priorities. Like, it's more important that God sorts out the world so that people cast lots for clothes twice and it sorts out a prophecy than it is for God to eradicate malaria. And that to me is like, what a weird priority that is. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Like, why does he care that they spit upon him, right, as a fulfillment of some idea that they spit upon the sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible? They have to have that happen, but he can't somehow arrange the world in a way that, well, let's see, we don't die. We just don't die at all. Like, Jesus's death happens, he supposedly resurrects, and we just don't die. If you believe in me, Jesus says, right? I'm interpreting this in a literal way, but why not just say, you believe in me, you will never die? Oh, okay, he says that. So like if that became true, I think all of us would be idiots to not believe it, because we'd all be alive. Like, hey, John over there, he's been around. You were born in 23 AD, weren't you? Yeah, man. What's up, dude? Okay, so hey, we're all believing because that's the way the world is. And actually he shows us. But no, it's so weird. He's hidden so much, and then the ridiculousness in the way he does set it up. It's the priorities they had then aren't what we're seeing in retrospect, you know?
So if you really want someone to believe, put a cross on the moon, right? Or just put ideas in people's head. If you really want all of humanity to believe in you and come into some loving union with you, then you can do a damn sight better than presenting us in these days with a 2,000-year-old text, which looks a bit like a puzzle, whereby, oh, you've got a bunch of Psalms and a bunch of these Old Testament scriptures that could, if you squint your eyes and look just left a little bit, then maybe they might prophesy Jesus's death and resurrection. But essentially, it doesn't really look like that. It looks like the gospel writers are actually going back through the Old Testament, trying to validate some kind of thing that they weren't expecting, which is their Messiah to be killed, and then throwing as much as they can at the narrative and creating a narrative even to reflect that. That looks far more likely than actually, you know, that those were really prophecies, and this is the best way you've got of revealing your godly nature.
Yeah, you take the time first saying, let's deal with the philosophical problem. I became a philosophical determinist based on, or theological determinist. I mean, like I was in the vein of Calvinism.
Yeah.
I said, I went ahead and accepted the lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world. That was a hint to me in Revelation that this was all part of the plan. This was all part of the plan. I read Romans 9. Paul's saying, like, this has got to go down. He prepared people for glory. He prepared people for destruction. All part of his plan. So I had no problem swallowing that. The problem is when we start getting into the details and then you are comparing things and then looking at the text they come from, and they don't even mean what the text they come from mean oftentimes. And there's even subtle changes in the grammar in which ways they use it to make their point, so that they're kind of tweaking the Old Testament in a way to make their point in the New Testament to fulfill these prophecies. Thank you, Robert. I appreciate the super chat, my friend. Always looking out.
Yeah. So the question is, do Christians who believe these truly are prophecies, are they doing the same to prophecies in other religions? Or are they using special pleading in order to say, well, these particular prophecies are definitely true, but I will use a real skeptical metric when it comes to evaluating the prophecies in other religions or in the Quran? Right. And of course, it looks very much like special pleading, because to me, I mean, what's more likely, that Christians would that these really are true prophecies, that these half verses from certain Psalms, which aren't prophetic writing anyway, are prophecies, but the other half of that verse isn't a prophecy. So just like literally half a line can be applied to Jesus, and that's a true prophecy? Or is it more likely that the gospel writers are going back and rewriting or writing the narrative in a way that it looks to be a prophecy fulfillment and a validation of their claims? Can I just share with you what I shared with you previously, but it's just as prevalent today.
Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, I will share this with you. So can you see that?
I can.
Brilliant. So again, this is to just remind viewers that this is someone writing about John Dominic Crossan and about how he concludes that the Gospels were created. And I think this is so super on the money, right? So he says it's split up into three different sections: P1, P2, P3, right? And P1, Jesus dies, right? This human dies. P2, the disciples go away and try and interpret the meaning of his death in light of the scriptures. And P3, they then write the scriptures. And he says that during P1, Jesus was crucified, but his earliest followers knew none of the details of his execution. During P2, Jesus' disciples interpreted the meaning of his death in light of the Old Testament, but they did so without reference to the particular details of the Passion events, right? So then they're really they're almost forgetting what actually happened and now saying, well, our Messiah, this guy, died And now we need to understand that fully in light of the scriptures. And this new narrative, a brand new narrative, is going to appear in our minds, and we're going to pass that along orally in oral tradition. And then during this P3, this third period, Jesus' followers organized the complex array of scriptural proof texts into a coherent and sequential narrative, refining and augmenting the story with verisimile historical detail. So then they create this supposed historical detail. But they do so out of the Old Testament scriptures that they've gone around looking for to validate Jesus. So it's not a case of the prophecies predicting Jesus, or even that Jesus just coincidentally did the same things, or the gods coincidentally cast lots. Because you could say that. You could say it's actually more probable that gods on 2 occasions was cast lots. Maybe it's a regular thing. Maybe they cast lots for Jesus' clothes, and it just coincidentally maps onto something in the Old Testament. But what I think is more likely is that the gospel writers just went to the Old Testament straight away. How do we understand that? The cognitive dissonance had happened. How do we understand that our Messiah has died? This wasn't part of what we believed. Oh, right, we've got a sacrificial lamb style Messiah. It's not a military leader. This is completely different. And we are going to create this narrative based on bits and pieces we can nick from the Old Testament and throw it at this new narrative, create this new narrative and present this new Jesus, not the real Jesus, not the historical Jesus, but this mythological overlay, this legendary figure that may well have had the nugget of truth at the beginning. Jesus, as our cult leader, died. But this new truth is a brand new narrative that's created out of scriptures.
You talk about, and in light of what you just said there, I think you mentioned in the Gospels, one of the earlier ones, they're not even there. So how could they account of this event? They weren't actually there to witness and see all the details of the supposed, especially the piercing of the side. Matthew, that's a whole thing. I don't want to get there yet because I know that you probably want to get to the whole Matthew thing. That I did not even know that, by the way. I thought John was the only one that did this, and there's a reason I thought that.
So this reminds me of a conversation I had with you privately the other day, which is to say that when you say, so as skeptics, we say, right, the Gospels weren't eyewitness accounts, right? They weren't eyewitness accounts. Some Christians still maintain the Gospels were eyewitness. So let's assume they're right? Let's assume that Matthew literally was an eyewitness of Jesus. But what does that mean? What that means for the Christian is that Matthew knew Jesus. It doesn't, but when we unpick that, it doesn't mean that Jesus was alive. Matthew was alive and watching Jesus's nativity. That's obviously ridiculous. And it also doesn't mean that Matthew was present at every single story in Matthew's gospel, because that's insane. Some of that, Jesus was in the wilderness for some of that. So even if you think Matthew
Binoculars.
was yeah. So what's that? Say that again, because I can't.
Repeat that, Satan. Repeat that.
Yeah, say that thing that was in your mind. Say that again out loud, because I've just got to write it down on my slate or whatever. So even if you think that Matthew was an eyewitness, right, which I would completely argue is not possible, but even if you did, you would have to argue that he was at every single event in Jesus's life in order for him to be an actual eyewitness of those events. Otherwise, he is still just hearing this from hearsay. Whether it comes from Jesus or another apostle or someone else, he is not actually an eyewitness. So there is no eyewitness. There can be no eyewitness to all of these events, because the people who are writing it are necessarily at least secondary evidence and more likely tertiary evidence. And so they are writing hearsay down, and they just weren't eyewitnesses. So when it comes to things like having a side pierced and then water and blood gushing out, who can verify that? Who was there? So you've got guards there. So the guards would have been keeping them at a distance. And so who knows that was blood and that was blood and water, right? Is it then the guards? So now the guards the eyewitnesses, and the guards are actually,
that's the point you write in your book. You're like, okay, so now you have a supposed guard who'd be your only, like, right up close and personal, not like what you see in Mel Gibson's movie. Very much doubt. You've got Mary and an apostle, one of the close ones to Jesus, standing there next to this guy who's water and blood sprinkling onto him. No, in reality, they're guarding them from being able to be close and and touch them and whatever. And here you have this guard who's actually witnessing and knows. So now he has to go, hey, Matthew, come here. Hey, I know you're probably going to end up writing something about this later. So I want to let you know there's water and blood that came out of his side. Whatever you can do with that in your story, make sure you do it. It's like, what's more probable? This is an eyewitness guy telling of this thing that actually happened, and somehow it magically, in some philosophical way, which you solve so many problems, matches some type of convenient Hebrew Bible or Septuagint concepts of prophecy, or even, it's not even prophecy. You talk about how this gets into stuff that's not even technically prophecy, but how they would go about sacrificing things and the ritual of blood and all that. Like, what are they doing with this?
Well, what is interesting about the blood and the water is that actually people don't really understand even what that theology is. So the writers, the gospel writers, often or sometimes had theological ideas in their head. So we know, for example, there are a lot of scriptures that are missing that Matthew in particular said this is referring to the scriptures, and actually we don't have those scriptures still. This happens, you know, throughout the gospels, but I think Matthew is one that makes particular reference, and so that leads people going, well, that's interesting. We don't actually even know what this refers to. But in this situation, people don't really know what the water and the blood means. Like, why this would have happened. I mean, it has obviously some theological meaning, because otherwise why would God create this situation where water and blood comes out? He's not just going to sit there and says, you know what, when I sacrifice myself to myself and I'm crucified on that cross, I'm going to make sure that blood and water comes out when I get pierced in the side. I either do that for complete randomness, which is weird, or I do it for symbolic meaning, which is also weird, because no one could work out what that symbolic meaning is, because this had symbolic meaning to the author, but we don't have access to the author's head and what the reasoning for that was. So I think there's loads of interesting stuff to do with symbology, to do with theology, but
are we at the pierce side part? Because I didn't.
No, we're not. So
I don't want to get there then yet.
Yeah. So I mean, the nature of the problems with prophecy is that the source text for the prophecies, if they're the Psalms, they're not prophetic text. Okay, so Psalm 22 and Psalm 69, for example, two of the most famous ones that are supposedly prophetic, are lamentations. These are written by a psalmist who is like, my life is terrible. It's all horrible. Woe is me. And saying that even though I believe in God and blah, blah, blah. And so they are not prophetic. They don't mention the resurrection. They don't even mention the death, right? They just mention these weird things that are picked out, like casting lots and stuff like that. And they make no sense of they're not messianic, and they also make no sense of the Holy Trinity. So when you have, if you apply these things to the Messiah, to Jesus, even if you do think they're prophetic, they make absolutely no sense of the Holy Trinity. And so you just got lots of problems with using these as prophetic texts. But that's just the Psalms. If you then go across to Isaiah 53, Isaiah 9, and these other texts, that, okay, Isaiah was a famous prophet, but are these particularly prophetic texts? And if they are they prophetic to something else? Well, yes, actually, King Ahaz and these different situations. Then the Christian has to say, well, they're as you said, they're double dipping. They're prophetic to this thing, which it makes sense, and to Jesus, and actually that doesn't really make sense. So when you look at the source material, you're like, this doesn't really make sense if you apply it wholesale to Jesus. It can only make somewhat sense if you apply little bits of it to Jesus. But then that's really weird, because I can take Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes and I can take sentences out of there and apply that to my life, or Emma Raducanu, who just won the US Open, right? And I could take sentences out of Sherlock Holmes and apply that to Emma Raducanu and say, look, that was prophesied in Arthur Conan Doyle. If you're accepting that you can cherry pick certain verses and certain excerpts, but the rest of it doesn't need to make sense, then literally any text on earth can be prophetic.
Yeah, we could use the Old Testament right now and find prophecies of ourselves and make our own narrative. And, you know, you bring up Psalm 22, you go deep and you quote a scholar on that particular one. But the idea of they pierced my hands and feet, or like a lion, my hands and my feet, And there's this imagery here, and I guess it's maybe a Hebraism, because in the ancient Near East, lions, they'd have a artwork where the lions would kind of pounce, and you'd have the man kind of pinned to the ground, if you will, or pinned with his hands being uh, like a lion's on top of you, kind of like this idea. It's an image of a lion who's kind of got your hands pinned, but at the same time, it's the idea that I'm exhausted. I am at my wit's end in this battle, in this war against my enemies. And that's kind of the picture that we have. And sure, you could see that if you want to kind of lift it and apply that idea. Well, Jesus was surrounded by his enemies and this, that, but they make it literal, pierce hands and feet. And that's a big.
Yeah, and I think this comes from the for dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers has encompassed me, they pierced my hands and my feet, I can count all my bones, blah blah blah. And I think that's that particular verse from Psalm 22. I'm hoping, yes. So that's verse 16 in Psalm 22. Now, this is famously problematic because for Christians, well, for the gospel writers have applied this to Jesus because they look at the word pierced and they think yes, but actually this depends on the Septuagint, and this is the same with the Nativity book with Alma being translated to Parthenos, so young woman being translated to virgin, and then saying, look, the Jesus' mother must be a virgin. Actually, no. If you look at the original text, it's much better translated as young woman, and so therefore it makes much more sense in the context. What you are doing is you are mistranslating this and then writing this as a prophecy to prophesy Jesus, and then creating this second event that has to conform to an incorrectly translated so-called prophecy. And it's just nonsense, and it all falls apart as soon as you point out the fact that that's a poor translation. This happens with Psalm 22. It's a poor translation, and this is generally accepted within Hebrew Bible scholastics, which is that actually it doesn't mean pierced. It better means pinned, or actually there's loads of options. There's quite a lot of work that's been done around just that one word about what it means, but pierced is almost certainly the least likely translation of that word. And if it doesn't mean pierced, then that so-called excerpt, that so-called prophecy as an excerpt makes no sense. But what Psalm 22 makes much better sense as is exactly what it is, which is a lamentation. Which, I mean, your friend Josh Bowen, he did a PhD on lamentations in Assyriology in the ancient Near East, so he probably knows a lot about this. But you know, this type of this is common for psalmists to give a lamentation, which is woe is me, you know. And in fact, the beginning words of this are sort of why hast thou forsaken me, my God, why have you forsaken me? So, and that gets applied to Jesus because he supposedly says that on the cross in one particular gospel. But you're like, well, how does that make sense of the Holy Trinity? Who's he talking to? How's he forsaken himself? Like, okay, it makes sense if Matthew, which I think is the case, thinks that he's the Messiah, but not divine in the way that John does and later Christians do. Then I can make sense of that. He's a Messiah. He's not God. But as soon as you say, this is God, Jesus is God, I think the whole resurrection, the whole like death on the cross makes very little sense in the Holy Trinity, and the things that Jesus says make very little sense as well. So yeah, Psalm 22 is a whole bag of problems for people who think it's a prophetic scripture.
Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. The problems with them breaking his knees, yet he's supposedly already dead. So if you want to make sure they're dead, wouldn't you have just broke Jesus's knees? So to fulfill this prophecy of Exodus 12:46, where you're like, it is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring forth any of the flesh outside of the house, nor are you to break any bone of it. This sacrifice.
Sacrificial lamb. So this is what I said earlier, which is John. John does this because no other Gospels talk about the breaking of the legs. John specifically says they didn't break his legs in order to fulfill the blah, blah, blah. And this is because John wants him to be the Paschal lamb. But we know that for crucifixions, they used to break your legs to hasten death because basically when you're crucified, you're out like this, or you can't really see me, but I've got my arms out and I'm sustaining my body weight through my feet and legs. And I sustain my body weight through my feet and legs, and that stops, basically it stops my my body crushing itself, and
Right.
basically you end up dying through crucifixion, through asphyxiation, through not being able to breathe properly because your innards start crushing and you can't sustain. But you sustain yourself for longer by using your legs. So in order to kill people, the Roman guards used to break their legs so that they couldn't sustain that body weight. But for some reason they didn't do that. These Roman guards thought, oh, we're not going to do that with Jesus, according to John, and instead we're going to pierce his side just to make sure he's dead, and then blood and water came out. But that's wholly theological. It makes no sense for the Romans to do that. But why are they ending up doing that? Why has God made this happen? It's so it looks like Jesus is a sacrificial lamb. At least it does for John, because it doesn't happen in the others. Because
Right.
John is writing a different theology. I talked to you about audience, purpose, and form. Right? Each of these writers have their form, their content is determined by the audience and the purpose. Who am I writing for, and why am I writing this? So I'm writing this for these particular people, and I'm trying to convince them that Jesus is the new Paschal Lamb, and that you don't have to have the Passover meal anymore because you just need to have Eucharist. And this is my theology. I'm delivering that to you, and I'm writing later as John, and I've refined my theology. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't really know that because they don't really understand the theology yet, because they haven't gone through this process of the best part of 100 years.
This is interesting. We got a super chat. Great question. And thank you for the question being on the topic at hand. Really appreciate it. Linda Roberts for the support. Did Matthew and Paul make up all this twisted scriptural interpretation, or whether it was already in the air, as it were? What are your thoughts on that?
I think in one sense it's impossible to know. So all you can do is have conjecture. But I think that realistically, so what we do know is that certain ones of these quotes are literally half a line's worth or half a verse worth of quote, where it makes sense for the first half of the verse, but it doesn't make sense for the second half of the verse, which means that I think it just looks like massive quote mining, cherry picking. And I think that's what happened. And when maybe your audience isn't super Jewish or doesn't know the text that much, and so therefore it's like, and you see this nowadays with Christians. Modern Christians will say, you get these Bob Duco and these people like that who come out and say Jesus is a fulfillment of all these scriptures, and they list, and they have absolutely no intention of then reading the context around a particular verse,
right,
to see whether actually does that work? Does the whole verse work? No, it doesn't. In fact, the second half of the verse completely invalidates the first half of the verse being used. So it's a really, really bizarre heuristic, hermeneutic, like biblical interpretation technique. It's just really dodgy to be so overtly cherry picking. And I think that's what the authors did, because I think they were so blown away by the cognitive dissonance of a Messiah actually dying, and it's so not what was supposed to happen with the Jewish Messiah, that they were pretty desperately going through the Bible to see how they could justify Jesus still being the Messiah.
If I could just address this question for a second, Linda, this is an interesting question, because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that they did this midrash type thing and applied older material and were convinced it was going to apply to their time. Not only that, Paul seems to be doing this, what I call recontextualizing other material to apply to his ethne, and so his Gentiles. So he's using, these scriptures, and he's kind of lifting them and applying them, and he'll even limit what he says about them, or even change them in a weird way, or somewhat of a weird way. Like Galatians 3, to give you one example, and we'll move on. He talks about the promise to Abraham was to his seed, singular, not to many seeds. And it's like, hold on, no. When you go back to Genesis, like, it's clear that Abraham's, if you will, his children and all of his offspring, this promise is to them, plural, all of them. But Paul says, oh, no. This is to only one, and that one is Christ. Like, it's like, whoa, you literally just lifted and reinterpreted Genesis and applied it to Jesus instead of the genetic offspring of Abraham. So that's the way I'm looking at it. And he does this in many ways. Maybe rabbis do this in some sense too, because, 1 Corinthians 9, Paul quotes about how he wants, you're supposed to help pay me money. How come the other apostles can get money and they can have wives and they go and you guys take care of them? But I don't want any money. I don't want any money. But then he quotes this verse in the Old Testament where he says, for it is written, you shall not muzzle your oxen while it threshes. Talking about this is a law about an animal. And he says, but God, is God really concerned with the animals? No, he says he's talking about me. He literally uses a animal like law and says this is somehow prophetic about him. So that this like common practice of lifting things and applying them, it seems to me that that's in the air in a way too.
Yeah, so I think this pesha, this like the rabbinic sort of technique of reinventing old stories to become current and applicable to the audience or to themselves, I think, yeah, is really prevalent in rabbinic tradition. And you can see that being used here, which is, but the question is, you know, does it give it any more truth? The you know, are these, see, it's not so much an allegory. So where you're talking there is quite a symbolic thing about oxen and blah blah blah, but not actual oxen, isn't it? You know, casting lots for clothes is this is supposedly actually an event that really happened. So it's a prophecy of a real supposedly real historical event. And you know, you get these ideas. Psalm 69 has so I keep talking about like one half of the verse and not the other half of the verse. So Psalm 69 has, for example, they also gave me a bitter herb in my food, and for the first they gave me vinegar to drink. So Jesus is given vinegar to drink, and they talk about myrrh. Mark talks about myrrh, but then it's changed later to this other word. But basically, it can mean poison. So it's like, so the second half of the verse is like Jesus being given vinegar to drink, but the first half of the verse is Jesus being given poison in his food. Now, the first half of the verse didn't happen in the resurrection narrative, but the second half supposedly did. So how can you have a prophecy that where you've clearly just taken the second half of a verse and ignored the first half? So surely the first half invalidates the prophecy. You know, you can't just, can you have a prophecy that's just like, yeah, it's a bit of a prophecy. I mean, it depends how you look at it, but most of it doesn't apply. And in fact, none of these prophecies prophesy the resurrection. Surely, if you're talking about the most important part of this story, the resurrection, why did none of these supposed prophecies, whether it be Psalm 69, 34, 22,
Zechariah 12,
Isaiah 53, none of these really even talk about death. But if they do, they don't talk about resurrection. That'd be the main thing you want to be prophesying. And why do these prophecies not also prophesy cars, germ theory, aeroplanes? You know, it's obscene that you've got, yeah, it's definitely a prophecy that's come true. This guy predicted real nebulous things that involve predicting the future, but only in the context of something that's really nebulous to do with suffering or this or that. None of these prophets predict like aeroplanes, guns, you know, mass transport, intercontinental ballistic missiles. None of them do that. It's just, it's because they're not really prophecies. And in fact, it's generally accepted in Hebrew scholarly circles. I mean, not generally, it's fully accepted that Old Testament prophecies were post hoc written. So you had the events, you had the events, right? And then you had the prophecy that's supposed to be back here, right? But it's actually written here. But I'm pretending to be back here and prophesying this event. So that's accepted now in academia. They weren't prophetic; they were written after the accounts.
And the technical term is called ex eventu. Is the idea that these, and you know, that's how they date Daniel, right? The prophet Daniel. They know when he gets things all wrong. This guy really was guessing. And then before that, it was like, well, I already know some of this based on the history I'm looking. So we have good reason to say what you're saying makes sense. Mr. Monster, thanks for the super chat. Shout out to the best Mythbuster channel. I appreciate the love, my friend. This brings up great points on all of this stuff is irrelevant. All of the like what we have experienced today. None of that's predicted, but what matters is they cast lots for his bloody garments, or they put a crown of thorns on his head, or they, you know, make sure they lashed him 39 times or whatever, you know, like there's always something. I know.
Yeah, so Isaiah 53, Jesus is supposed to be the servant, but that refers really to Israel. and you've got Isaiah being hopeful about Israel, and it's about redemption. But then parts of it, and it's written in the past tense. It's like this has happened. So it's not even saying this will happen. It's like this has happened. This has come to pass. And then it talks about prolonged life, shared spoils. So you need to go and read Isaiah 53, and it's like, this doesn't apply to Jesus in any way. Jesus never had bounty given to him by his peers. He didn't have offspring, so it talks about his seed. He doesn't have offspring. It wasn't beaten and afflicted by God, which is what happens in Isaiah 53. And again, it makes absolutely no sense of the Holy Trinity. So there's literally no way that you can say Isaiah 53 prophesies Jesus without being accused of cherry picking. It's just, you can't do it. You can't do it. So don't do it.
I put the cherries on our thumbnail on purpose.
Yeah, sure.
There's a quote you mentioned on page 129. For those of you who are tuning in and aren't aware, this is the work that we're discussing. This is Jonathan's book, The Resurrection, a Critical Examination of the Easter Story. And I put a star next to things that really stood out to me that I thought we can kind of elaborate as time goes by. I hope I'm not jumping too far ahead either.
No, you do whatever you want.
Okay. One must wonder why, after knowing that Jesus was dead, the Roman soldiers still pierced his side. If they really wanted to make sure he was dead, they would have simply carried out their orders and broken his legs. It would be a Roman win-win. John clearly has the Jews wanting to take the bodies down so they are not hanging over the Jewish holiday. The soldiers did not break Jesus' legs because he was presumably already dead. This purported incident allows Jesus to be the Paschal Lamb based in the Hebrew Bible, ruling that the Paschal Lamb's legs should not be broken. As we saw earlier, when discussing the day of crucifixion of the Last Supper, it is only John that has the meal, not as the Passover meal, because the crucifixion takes its place. Jesus himself is the sacrificial lamb dying on the day of preparation when all the lambs are slaughtered for Passover. This information doesn't feature in any other gospel. I think that's important information to leave out too.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was saying before, which is John's writing theology. So he's got something he wants to deliver, and that's why he has different information that is different to the synoptics, because they didn't have that theology. They hadn't developed their theology of the Trinity, or at least I don't know that even John had particularly established a Trinity. But there's this idea that the beginning, that the Logos, Jesus was God in a very meaningful way. John had that, but the synoptics didn't, and that's why he is delivering a different set of theological points. One of which is that Jesus is the sacrificial lamb. So I think that there's a lot of sort of casual prophesying that's going on here in the Gospels that sounds good. You've got to remember as well that these were oral tales, right? That people were going from community to community, spreading these orally and saying, check this out. Here's a story about Jesus. This is why he's the Messiah, because this happened and this happened and this happened. You've got these expectant people listening to this and going, yeah, he's just mentioned that, the casting of lots. I know that's from Psalm blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah. They're not sitting there with a Bible going through this going, oh, yeah, but I think you'll find the first half of the verse didn't quite validate Jesus. And this makes no sense of the Holy Trinity. Because of course they didn't have those ideas.
This is the reason the Jews rejected it. I mean, they saw it and were like, hold on, man. Now you're on my turf, okay?
Yeah.
You're in my turf and you're going to hijack Isaiah 53. I know this chapter and the next 5 by heart. Nice try, buddy. Take your crap somewhere else. I'm not interested. But here's a good one. Aryan says, thanks for the super chat. He says, not just the Gentiles were ignorant. Which Jew could afford a Bible, scroll, or a history book? Think it was all murky with a lacking canon. So whoever's reading this are obviously or buying this story are not you're high up. They're definitely not.
That, Aryan, is awesome. This is such an important point. So we are living in a time which is incredibly fortuitous. We've got books coming out of our whatever. We've got books, Bibles, a printing press. everyone can have the internet. Everyone has access, and we can analyze the hell out of everything. We have knowledge that people at that time could only dream of having, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that most things were done orally, and you didn't have the ability, let alone the wherewithal, to cross-reference, let alone the desire to cross-reference everything that you were being told. So this is a really important point that's often overlooked, is that we look at things from a modern viewpoint and say, well, you know, X, Y, and Z. But these people wouldn't have had the ability to cross-reference the claims that were being made about Jesus, whether you were a Jew or not. And you had these repositories like the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they're a real special place. Now they're thinking that was a place where people visited once a year to do these particular festivities, right? That these were special scrolls, and even then they were only relatively recently put together, and this is still an ongoing process. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Well made.
Yeah, and I think, like, who are the enemies? Notice the guys who are not accepting the damn message. All right. Now, I know that's literary as well, but imagine you're going to talk to Pharisees, Sanhedrin, Sadducees. These are people who are acquainted with their literature to some degree. They're not going to look at this and go, yeah, I believe it. Like, get out of town, buddy. You know.
So what will this look like? This looks like exactly what happened, which is Christianity found its purchase outside of Palestine and Israel and that area. It found most of its purchase in the Hellenized sort of Greek diaspora, but then going into the Roman Empire, and it had that particular flourishing after Constantine and blah blah blah. You know, but really failed to take make huge inroads in the area where Jesus was actually from, because you had far greater knowledge of the Hebrew Bible and texts as was, you know. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, Derek.
Interesting. ScholarVid said, thanks for the super chat, by the way. Can't early Christianity be explained as a natural evolution of Jewish apocalypticism? Continues. As we move from John the Baptist to Jesus and eventually to Paul, there's a gradual relaxation in interpretation of Jewish law, which in time made that religion more appealing to pagans. I definitely think there's a evolution.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
So I can't remember if I was talking with you about this or to Tim from Harmonic Atheist, but the idea is that Paul definitely went through these and the early Christian church went through this evolution, because at the end of the day, the job for these sect believers was to make sure that their select existed onwards and grew. Right? If you really believe this, you want everyone to believe this. So
Right.
you've got in order to get everyone to believe this, you aren't going to go in with like, you should believe this, and by the way, in order to believe this, you need to cut off the end of your penis, because that ain't gonna sell your belief system. So you have to change your belief system, drop the Jewish rules, because there were so many Jewish rules that made it kind of prohibitive for this to be a huge success. Judaism is up against it because of all the mitzvah, all those 613 rules you've got to do, and having to cut the end of your penis off and all this kind of stuff. It's like, you know, I'm not going to want to do that. But if you say, actually, you don't have to do that anymore, and this sacrificial lamb, you don't have to leave you don't have to stay in your house while it's dark on Passover, because what you do is you just go and drink the blood, which is wine. Everyone likes to drink wine, and eat a wafer, a bit of bread or whatever. You know, that's the blood and body of Christ. Job done. And you're like, yeah, I can do that every week or however it was sold in that times. That then becomes an evolved, easily and much more palatable religious scenario.
And this is a really good one, and really appreciate the support. Stop scamming, man, always comes through. Thank you for the super chat. His redemption for original sin is such overkill. Why not have him come just 1 or 2 generations later and atone with a payment in kind with interest? Jesus provided a truckload of bananas for your sins. That would be catchy.
I mean, we talked about how atonement doesn't make sense at all, and in fact, original sin doesn't make sense. I talked to you about the two-horn dilemma with the design of Adam and Eve and sin. But so part of that, I mean, you go and look at the previous videos. We do that, but yeah, I mean, it is. Since that's the central part, so Jesus' resurrection is a central part of or death and resurrection is a central part of Christianity, which means atonement is a central part of Christianity because that's why he died. And if you can make no sense of the atonement and show that it's just complete overkill and doesn't make sense anyway, it doesn't make sense of the Trinity, doesn't make sense of anything, then you can probably think of much better ways of making sense of it. But this was all because it was post hoc rationalized. So people 200 years later had these core gospel texts and they said, right, and how do we make sense of all of this? How do we make sense that now we've come to think that Jesus is actually God? How do we make sense of God sacrificing himself? How do we make sense of atonement? And of course, people don't make sense of it still, because that's why there's so many different theories. And it's best explained by the fact that it doesn't really make much sense. It's best explained by people are still trying to make sense of the gospel narratives.
And this is the amazing thing. Christians are doing this still today. They're writing books now about how many more prophecies he actually did fulfill. Like they're gold mining, finding connections, and they're still doing this, which I want to get in after I get this super chat on the screen. When prophecies aren't prophecies, that section is really interesting in your book. I'll read that here in just a moment. Joseph of Arimathea providing his tomb sounds contrived, and we're going to get into this too. Perhaps to explain Jesus not being communally buried or burned in Gehenna and thereby resurrecting by bursting through the mud like a zombie.
Yes, so we will come on to him a bit later. I mean, there's a whole we could speak for a couple of hours on Joseph of Arimathea alone, but
I love that too. That's a good chapter. But yeah, thank you for the super chat again. Stop Scamming Man. I really appreciate the support, the love.
Remind us of that question in a little while.
Yeah, remind us. That is really. There's some good stuff about Joseph that we need to get into.
When we talk about prophecy, and again, trying to go through and apply all these prophecies to Jesus, the great place to look is, again, the nativity. So you've got Jesus is called Jesus of Nazareth. My theory is that Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth. So therefore, as a real human, because I'm a historicist, I won't die on that hill, but I think this guy really existed, and he was called Jesus of Nazareth. As a result, his people who followed him at the time knew him as that. So when they were going and rewriting his birth story, they had to take into account he's from Nazareth in some way. So Luke does this by having a census that he has to go to Bethlehem, and Matthew has him already living in Bethlehem and eventually getting scared off to Egypt and coming back to Nazareth because it was safe a couple of years later. Now, why do they need him in Bethlehem? Because they've gone back through the Old Testament and found, actually, I would argue, a slight mistranslation, because I don't think it means the Messiah has to be from Bethlehem. He has to be from the Bethlehem line. But they interpret that as, shit, we need him to come from Bethlehem. So, sorry, oh dear, we need him to come from Bethlehem. So they have him born there. Right. Jesus of Nazareth is born in Bethlehem, but then they're like, but we also need him to come out of Egypt. Or Matthew thinks I need him fulfilling this prophecy that he comes out of Egypt, and then also you know this and that, and then so in the end you have all these different prophecies that are kind of vying. They're thrown at Jesus, but it's like trying to make them all work at the same time. Yeah, it's really difficult.
You point out, like, just to bring up one of those points you brought up about he has to come out of Egypt. Well, how do they do that? Now they got to throw Herod in the mix to make Herod a new Pharaoh to have him come out of Egypt. Why are they doing that? I mean, if you look at Exodus, the Exodus story is complete. But then you look at these passages, as out of Egypt I've called my son. That's past tense. Yeah. That's nothing to do with the future. That has to do with what happened according to the narrative of the Exodus.
Yeah, so this is Matthew having Jesus as a new Moses. I mean, Dale Allison's written a book on this, but Jesus, if you map out the Matthew narrative, you know, you've got basically Jesus and Moses is hugely important, obviously for the Jews and for Matthew's audience. That this is just basically tick box, Jesus as Moses. That's why he needs to come out of Egypt because that's what Moses did, and that's how Exodus happened. Yeah.
So you, in this page 131 of your book, for everybody who's keeping along, there's a quote by Michael J. Alter, and you said this misappropriation of verses for prophecy is just as much the case for Psalm 34. The idea that this psalm foreshadows Jesus' crucifixion is not warranted, as Michael J. Alter observes. There is absolutely no indication that Psalms 34 is intended as prophetic. Furthermore, there's no indication that Psalms 34 applied to Jesus. The theme of Psalms 34 is that the righteous man is saved from the wicked. When the wicked attempt to impose suffering on this righteous man, They could not break any of his bones because God protected him. Not only was this righteous man protected, but also the wicked are slain. In contrast, Jesus was not saved, and the wicked, the Romans who are crucifying him, were not slain. Finally, nothing is mentioned about the Messiah being killed. In short, Psalms 34 has nothing to do with Jesus. I thought that was just direct and straight to
Yeah,
the point.
yeah. So when you have in the Old Testament, right, or in the Hebrew Bible, obviously a shed load of stuff about kings, about anointing, because that's what you did with the kings, about sacrificial lambs, because Passover, about wise counselors. When you have all this stuff, loads of stories that are narratives that include those motifs, then you have so much ammunition to throw Old Testament scriptures at Jesus. It's just like you can't fail to be able to find stuff that would apply to, or that you could make apply to Jesus.
On the next page, you say, in fact, if you read through Zechariah 12 through 14, because you go into that particular passage, verse by verse, you will be left with absolutely no doubt that this completely refers to something other than the life and death of Jesus. God did not destroy the enemies of Israel after Jesus' death, but actually oversaw Israel's occupation and Jerusalem and its temple being destroyed, with hundreds of thousands of Jews being murdered. Thomas Ice of the Christian Liberty University declared in his piece writing against preterism. I had to note this because I was a full preterist as a Christian. So I was on the defense that this somehow all was fulfilled. Everything was.
Yeah, yeah.
And he says in this analysis on Zechariah and how it cannot refer to Jesus, because of the difference between the above contrasted passages, it is impossible to harmonize with events that have already taken place. Impossible as long as 2 plus 2 continues to equal 4. I thought that was so funny because when you look at it, there's no way Zechariah 12 in any way, shape, or form is speaking of the first century at all. If anything, it's the opposite.
And the next couple of paragraphs, I say, there's a whole raft of claims that make no sense in the context of Jesus and that are arguably yet to happen. Out of the dozen or so claims, God will remove the land of unclean spirits, will remove from the land 2/3 of the people who will then die. The living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of the eastern sea, half to the western. God will punish all the nations who do not go up to keep the festival of the booths, and so on. Like, again, it's like, if you're going to use Zechariah 12, you've just used like one verse out of that. I can do that with Arthur Conan Doyle. I can read Harry Potter, pick out a bunch of sentences and apply that to me and say, I am the Messiah and I was predicted by J.K. Rowling because a bunch of sentences are relevant to me. Right. Well, whoop-de-doo. So it's just, the whole notion of prophecy is, I think, broken and disproved by just reading those sources. Just read the sources.
You did an interesting note about the whole Psalms 22 thing about Gnosticism that I thought was interesting. Just brought that up. You said what it sounds like is Gnosticism, not in the Psalm, but when transplanted into the Gospels, the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, 3rd century, explains it this way: my God, when Jesus is quoting Psalms 22, why, Lord, have you forsaken me? And this says, Jesus spoke these words on the cross, for he had left that place. That is, Christ the God entered Jesus the man at baptism, remember the dove, but then abandoned Jesus at the crucifixion. So this is like a slap in the face of Trinity, really. But it also brings up Gnostic ideas of trying to understand this.
So then you can have, later gospel writer, John then saying, rejecting that, and that's so what you've got to question is, why do certain gospel writers have certain things written in, like whether it's what Jesus says or what happens, talk about the breaking of legs or not breaking the not breaking of legs. Why does that gospel writer have that and not the others? Right? It's not that. What are they communicating here? And it's like I said to you, I think I've said in the previous video, or maybe we're yet to come to that, which is the two-body hypothesis. So why is it that John is so up for having Jesus' body poked? And why is it that there's an empty tomb that you can argue didn't exist in Paul? And why is Jesus eating broiled fish? Like, why bother including that? It's because John wants to say this was a bodily resurrection. Jesus' body was there, right? And it's not. This is in I think, in being contrary to what Paul thought, I would conclude, as Richard Carrier, which is that there was a spiritual resurrection that went on and Jesus' body stayed there. And that's why there's no empty tomb narrative in Paul, because he didn't believe in an empty tomb. The body would have still been there. And Jesus had some kind of spiritual resurrection. And John is saying, no, that ain't true. And in fact, it's more and more, this is more and more the case throughout the Gospels. So Mark, Matthew, Luke, then John, each progressively had this idea that Jesus's body was resurrected, and it ends with John having people actually poke him. You know,
yeah.
So the question is, why are the differences? Because that tells you about their theology.
Not only that, I mean, your whole book so far, we're only 155 pages into the book by the time we're done with this episode, and you've already shown discrepancies that are irreconcilable. I mean, like, just so many problems between the Gospels. Harmonizing is the last probable thing you would even want to do. And I just love this. You say, continuing on page 136, on this logic, I could predict my own life by sifting through any old book that predates me and cherry picking a sentence here and sentence there. You know, this goes into what you've been saying. But then you say, again, it must be asked, what is the most likely explanation of the data? As a Christian, when you read such prophecy in other religions, you said this earlier, but I want to emphasize it. If you were reading other religions that are doing this, what do you hypothesize? Do you conclude straight away that all instances of prophecy are correct? If you apply skeptical metrics to another religion, why do you not apply the same metrics to yours?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I agree with me.
Dude, I hope you agree with you. That's at least something I hope we can come to, agree with.
Yeah. So, yes, absolutely. And I think the whole approach, just in general, to defending the resurrection is for a Christian is just an exhibition of special pleading. It's like you end up doing things to your own evidence that you would not do to the evidence of other religions, and you hold a special place for your own claims that inoculate them from the same kind of methodology you use to evaluate other religions. Yeah.
I must ask, do you have something before Matthew's spear piercing to discuss?
No, go for it.
Okay, so this is something that blew me away a little bit. I don't know all the source material and some of the oldest sources we have of our Gospels. I always thought the only gospel where Jesus is pierced in the side was John. Everyone knows the Roman soldier comes up, pierces him in the side, and he literally like cries out once this happens. He's like, "You are the Son of God. This is him." It's like, what? So I thought this is embellished and made up by John, but it's possible here that Matthew, in its earliest form or earliest what we have of earlier sources, has this in it. And I don't know if you'd like to take us into that a little bit, but the problem with it, comparing it to John, it's contradictory. It doesn't even chronologically make sense.
Yeah, so this is a quote from someone doing analysis. So the contention arises from a verse that is not even there! ! The King James Version leaves out the last part of Matthew 27:49, though it is present in the most ancient manuscripts. Quote, and another took a spear and thrust it into his side, and out came water and blood. Close quotes. The Moffat and Fenton translations both include this additional material. What makes it controversial is where these words appear, just before Jesus, quote, yielded up his spirit, verse 50, which is right. So it depends. So in John, it happens after his death, and in Matthew, it happens before. So what you get, the reason I included this, I include quite a few quotes that look into the analysis of these verses that are either there or not there, is that Christians disagree, and this is a point of quite a lot of contention and requires a lot of analysis, because either this is a contradiction between Matthew and John in where it happened, or it's a case of things being left out for particular reasons, and what's going on here, and the end result is, I conclude by saying, which is to say, and why bother devoting so much time to such a small quote that's most often not there, that the issue is not solved. Evidence goes both ways, and this is in this Matthean verse is redacted in most translations, even though it is the quote earliest and best manuscripts. Close quotes. Can we trust the Christian Bible, the translations, the interpretations of people with an agenda evidenced over time to the highest levels of the Christian churches? Because this analysis has also been taken to the highest level of the churches. Why do the Gospels continually contradict or differ from each other? Is this data better supported by the thesis that the Gospels accurately and truthfully portray supernatural events that they did not witness, or by the thesis that they are ex post facto, agenda-driven accounts written with unknown sources by people who weren't interested in the accurate recounting of historical events? So that one little verse, like the notion that it is in the earliest Matthean manuscripts, but not in most of them now. It appears in John, but it doesn't appear in the others. But then it appears in a different place, and has it been taken out because it disagreed with the timing of when that happened? Very blatantly disagrees with the timing. It's one of those contradictions that you cannot harmonize. He's saying it happened here, and he's saying it happened here. Those two don't harmonize. So was this redacted by later Christian redactors?
So real quick for our audience, just so you understand what he's saying, in a better manuscript tradition that goes way back in Matthew, in the narrative, there is this verse that has Jesus being pierced in the side before he was dead. Now imagine how that wouldn't work for John. John says they knew he was dead, but just to be sure, they jab him in the side. And now the flowing of blood and water. It's kind of this image that you paint in your head. One is he's alive and they jab him in the side. One is he's dead and they jab him in the side. And which is it? It cannot be both at the same time. You have a contradiction. And this might be why manuscript scribes, if you will, they drop it. They're like, let's drop this. I don't know,
But you often have these in the resurrection accounts. You have sort of John correcting things from others because he needs, either they were wrong. So Mark makes some Jewish claim. He wasn't too good on his Jewish custom. Some of his claims were corrected by Matthew, for example. But John changes things. And why is he changing things? So because he's got a particular agenda that requires things to be in a certain way. It's agenda driven. That's why I always talk about these texts are not history. They're writing theology. And so to cut, unless you have something else to say on prophecy.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I could go into before you get to blood and water, that paragraph, but go ahead.
I was going to talk about Yom Kippur.
Go ahead.
Okay. So what really seems to be going on with the Jesus narratives, the resurrection, the passion narratives, is a rewriting of Yom Kippur. What is Yom Kippur? It's the Jewish festival of atonement. Who knew? Right. So Jesus, remember, Jesus is replacing Judaism, or the Jewish laws. In John, it's a Paschal lamb. We're taking these Jewish ideas, but we're replacing them with a new kind of Judaism, which is Christianity, as it eventually became. So what is Yom Kippur? Well, you had the high priest. So here's your leader. Your high priest takes 2 goats and sets one of them free and sacrifices the other one. And that atones for the sins. What do we have in the gospel narratives? We have Pilate randomly letting one prisoner go free. This is something that is not attested to anywhere, right? As in outside of the gospels, this didn't happen, especially Pilate, who is a complete bastard. So he doesn't go, it's a Jewish festival, let's let one of you go free, right? That's never happened. There's no evidence of this ever happening outside the Gospels. So why does it happen in the Gospels? It's because Jesus is Yom Kippur. Jesus' resurrection is Yom Kippur. So we have 2 goats, one is let free to go into the wilderness. We have 2 prisoners, one is let free, or a bunch of prisoners, one is let free to go to go free. And the other one is sacrificed, and he becomes that atones for sins. So what do we have? We have this, but it gets even better because Matthew he changes a purple robe to a scarlet robe, right? Why is a scarlet robe put on Matthew's Jesus? It's because the custom is for scarlet wool to be tied around the goat's head, and a scarlet band placed among the thorns. So he has a crown of thorns turns up on Jesus. Why does that happen? Because we have this in Yom Kippur with the goats, a band of thorns. And Matthew changes that robe to be scarlet, which is clearly because Matthew wants Jesus to definitely, it wants no doubt about Jesus being the sacrificial lamb of Yom Kippur. And then you have possibly the goat being pierced. There is some evidence to suggest that the goat was pierced. Also, the goat was mocked. The scapegoat was mocked. So this is where we get the term scapegoat from. So you talked about spitting earlier. So they would spit on the scapegoat. And then, so, I mean, this is...
Yeah.
I've even I've got my hairs have stood on end because it's just so unbelievably a rewrite of the Yom Kippur, a festival of atonement. It's theologically a rewrite. It's the events are a rewrite. It is a rewrite.
Let me add something you emphasize on page 142 for those who have your book already. And by the way, we're about halfway, right? So we still have like probably 3 episodes. If you want to get the book before we're done, I highly recommend it. It's in the description. The Resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story. On page 142, to add to everything you just said, which is like, what makes more sense, guys? The author is using creative liberty to put the narrative onto the character, or all of this is historically true. And here's the interesting part. We talk about Jesus Barabbas in this context. Barabbas, most Christians go, all right, you have this murderer named Barabbas and you have Jesus. And we've seen this in the Mel Gibson clip that's so famously known. All right, I'm gonna let you guys have Barabbas because they harassed Pontius Pilate because he's such a good guy. Wink, wink. Like you said, he's a bastard. And here they release this Barabbas, but they don't know the early sources actually have the name Jesus Barabbas. And Barabbas just means son of the Father. So here you have Jesus Barabbas and you have Jesus the Christ, which are mirror opposites, literally mirror opposites. You've got the 2 goats, right? Yeah. Tell us, take us into this for a second, if you don't mind.
Well, the 2 goats were selected for 2 different outcomes, and they were supposed to be as identical in appearance as possible. They were supposed to be alike as twins. The commandment required that the 2 goats be identical in appearance, size, and value. These would appear as twins, the same on the outside, but with different destinies. So the fact that both were called Jesus would again fit into that whole motif of this being a reinterpretation of Yom Kippur, or a supersession. This is superseding. You as a Christian, as a newly found Christian, you don't have to go to Jerusalem and this doesn't have to be part of your life, because Jesus is the atonement of sins, and the Eucharist will be enough, and faith in Jesus, and this is replacing all that other stuff.
Yeah. Just to read that quote, you say, even if Origen's statement on Matthew 27:16-18, that some manuscripts of St. Matthew in his day read Jesus Barabbas, as opposed to Jesus called Christ, be not relied on. Here yet remains a very singular coincidence of name between the 2. Barabbas, son of the Father, stands in remarkable antithesis to the Son of Man, who claimed God as his father. I just thought it's interesting. They saw this, right? Origen and all of them saw this stuff, and they're like, what are we doing here? Now, Origen was more allegorical than a lot of the other fathers that were there, and he was also known as a heretic now, if you will. He's not, I guess you'd say he's not a saint according to the church itself. But he saw this problem, and he's thinking, I don't know if he called it a problem. He probably allegorized it. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's this idea that it makes so much sense. Like I love from an outsider, I love stuff like this, right? Because it makes loads of sense. Like if I was sitting down and wanted to replace Judaism with a new religion that was based within the context of Judaism, I need to take all of what Jews and myself as a Jew. And that's important. Like for some of those early Christians, the earliest of Christians would have been full-on Jews, right? I need to take these ideas and I need to represent them in a new way that gives them theological purchase on my audience, but also with myself. I need to understand, I used to have the Atonement of Sins Festival. We don't have, if I'm replacing that with my new belief system, how do I still get the atonement of sins? Now Jesus becomes the atonement of sins, right? So how does the Jesus story map onto Yom Kippur and two goats? Well, I'm going to write his death scenario in the context of Yom Kippur, and it's going to be an allegory of that, and that's brilliant. It's brilliant. I mean, as a piece of literature, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, the levels that they're operating on. Now, did it happen? No, because we've got Matthew changing details to fit this kind of new allegory. And we've got, you know, we've got no evidence of these kind of things happening ever historically, and yet they're written into the gospel. So this looks completely like making up stories to fit a framework and to fit an agenda.
I'm so with you, and I look forward to getting into Joseph of Arimathea. I think that's where you get this quote from Richard Carrier, if I'm not mistaken. There's Dennis McDonald. Yeah. So we're going to get there. I don't even want to say anymore other than 100% back you on that. It's literary. If there is some nugget of historical reality there, it's definitely kind of a camouflaged in. So most of this is fluff, theology. It's literary, and it's genius. Get that. There's the compliment. The problem is fundamentalists come in and they literally make this idol of literal historical approach, and they worship at the feet of this idol of literalism that they cannot even grasp the ingenious ideas that are being promoted here in a way that's so clever. You know, I mean, there is some clever stuff here.
So C.S. Lewis wrote Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? And you might say that's genius allegorization, right? So Aslan is Jesus, and this and that'll work. And you might read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you say, this is brilliant. I love the way that he's taking the Christian narrative and remolding it into this new tale. But it doesn't mean the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is true, right? It doesn't mean it's history. This is a guy that's taking a theological source and reinterpreting it in a way that finds its purchase with a new audience. But it doesn't mean the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe happened.
Right. I'm with you.
Yeah.
Now for this mysterious Joseph of Arimathea.
So where do we start? First of all, there's no such place as Arimathea. That's probably a good place to start, which is supposedly a city, Arimathea. And it's not on any map. There's literally no evidence of this place existing in the history of the universe, other than in the Gospels. So what explains that? So remember that our thesis as skeptics is that Joseph of Arimathea, most of the Gospel resurrection narratives didn't happen. And this is stuff being invented. There are literary mechanisms being used in order to present theology, in order to convince people, a lot of people who had some kind of working knowledge of Judaism, maybe, to believe in what we're saying, right? So that's our thesis. The Christian thesis is it's all 100% true. And if it has great theological symbolism as well, that's a bonus. But it doesn't invalidate it from being true.
First, it's true. And then from there, Exactly.
So what then which thesis best explains the data that Arimathea appears not to exist as a place? And I would say the skeptic's thesis is better evidenced by that piece of data, right? So then you get people like Richard Carrier has done a Greek analysis of Arimathea, Arimathea. So, and his analysis is I think is really interesting because it appears to mean best disciple town, right? So why would Joseph come from best disciple town? Well, this then starts making loads of sense because the Gospels definitely have something called the reversal of expectation motif, right? Reversal of expectation is quite simply, this is what we expect someone to do, and they end up doing the opposite.
Yes.
That's weird, right? So this works with the disciples that we expect the disciples to be awesome and to be Jesus' most fervent followers and to make all the right decisions. And they end up like rejecting him, denying him, doing all the wrong things. And this is definitely what happens. So the reverse of expectation motif is definitely a thing that is happening in the Gospels. But then what you have is a supposedly pious Sanhedrin member, so a person you would least expect to come to Jesus's aid. You have this guy then burying Jesus honorably as a high treasonous criminal. He is then given a special burial by Joseph in his own tomb, and he is called Joseph of Best Disciple Town. Is this theology, not history? So to me, but the reverse of expectation motif is even more interesting, and it's worth reading. Picking some of this up in you've spoken a lot to Dennis McDonald recently.
Yeah, so, I was actually going to say your quote that you put in your book. If you didn't mind, I'd love to read the one where Richard actually is harping on this.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, this is amazing. Bear with me. This is really good stuff. Take notes. You're going to want to check this out. It's a reversal of expectation that Jonathan has in his book here. You might want to get. All right. It's important to note that the motif throughout the Gospels is the reversal of expectation. Now I'm going to go back. One of Mark's strengths is his grasp of irony. As atheist author Richard Carrier says, talking of another scholar, Dennis McDonald's work, which I've got both of them on my Patreon. Like, I'm shooting out video after video, editing this right now. There are going to be 72 with both of these guys together. What I found, and this is Carrier, what I found additionally worthwhile is how McDonald's theory illuminates the theme of reversal of expectation, which so thoroughly characterizes the Gospels, not only in the parables of Jesus, where the theme is obvious, but in the very story itself. Though McDonald himself does not pursue this in any detail, his book helped me to see it even more clearly. James and John, who asked to sit at the right and the left of Jesus in his glory, are replaced by two thieves at Jesus' crucifixion. Simon Peter, Jesus' right-hand man, who was told he had to deny himself and take up his cross and follow, is replaced by Simon of Cyrene when it comes time to truly bear the cross, take up his cross. Jesus is anointed for burial before he dies, and when the woman goes to anoint him after his death, their expectations are reversed in finding his body missing. Later Gospels added even more of these reversals. For instance, in Matthew, Jesus' father, Joseph, is replaced by Joseph of Arimathea when the duty of burial arose, a duty that should have been fulfilled by the father. Likewise, contrary to expectation, the Mary who laments his death and visits his tomb is not Mary, his mother, but a prostitute. And while the Jews attack Jesus for healing and doing good on the Sabbath, they in turn hold an illegal meeting, set an illegal guard, and plot evil on the Sabbath, and then break the 9th commandment the next day. This theme occurs far too often to have been in every case historical, and its didactic meaning is made clear in the very parables of reversal told by Jesus himself, as well as, for instance, his teachings about family or hypocrisy and so on. These stories were crafted to show that what Jesus preached applied to the real world, real events, the Word made flesh.
So, boom. Yeah, that's a drop mic. I mean, it sounds like you literally did it, but like it's a drop mic. So all you, I mean, my hairs are going up on my arm. Like, why does this stuff excite me? It's crazy. So if you say, right, so I'm going to say, Derek, who's Jesus' mum and dad?
Mary and Joseph.
Mary and Joseph. So we know that king folk at the death of someone is super important, and burial tombs and family being buried in your family tomb is super, super important. As a criminal, okay, he's now killed as a criminal. So, this is not the Messiah. He's a criminal. Okay, massive reversal. So then, who was at his death and burial? Were his mum and dad there? No. So what were the names of the two main people that were there?
Joseph and Mary. Right.
Right. So Joseph and Mary were there, but Mary was a prostitute and Joseph was a Sanhedrin member.
Yeah.
Right. And then you've got Simon Peter is now Simon of Cyrene helping him carry the cross. And you've got all these other ones that made. But it's just like, if you don't see that, I mean, once you see that, again, it goes back to this is amazing. Like when you see what's going on here, these writers are brilliant. What they're producing is brilliant. It has such meaning now and such impactful force as a piece of literature. Of course, this isn't what happened. Like Mary and Joseph weren't like flukily just there as a Mary and Joseph doing all the things you'd expect his mum and dad to actually do. That's not what happened. This is such clever writing from these gospel. Of course, the Christians say, yes, this is what happened. This is the evidence for its veracity, right? And I would just say, no, that's stupendously improbable. And you would need to provide really good evidence. And the reason why it's improbable is because Arimathea doesn't exist. And loads of other things to do with Joseph that we're just about to talk about. So if you think that this is really what happened, then you would need to explain all this other data about Joseph as well. No, this is a literary mechanism, and it's a brilliant literary mechanism.
Yeah, and I think that it's really, honestly, it's sad to see what fundamentalist apologists and Christians are doing with this. And then they're going around as though they are the arbiter of understanding all this literature as it accurately is. This is fascinating stuff. I love some of the scholars that are Christians who come on and they recognize this stuff. Dale C. Allison, I've Ian Mills. These are Christian scholars who would look at an apologist Christian taking this literally and go, sorry, I'm not with you on this. I'm sorry, you're wrong. And in fact, they would oppose these kind of Christians that are taking this literal approach. So I just want to make that clear. This is not an atheist thing. Scholars who get serious into this, who investigate this stuff. You know, I saw a recent clip on Pine Creek. My friend Doug, he has a channel called Pine Creek.
He's I think I've heard of it, actually,
I love it. He did the show where he goes to Adam, the historical Adam or the theological Adam. Did Adam exist? Because William Lane Craig wrote a book on this. And Doug just let him play his clip and then just applied the same thing to the Gospels. But of course, don't go there. You can't go there. That's dogma. Remember, we're okay with letting Adam be somewhat allegory. Some Christians are, like William Lane Craig. He even has evolution in his ideas and stuff. But you get to the Gospels, that's the no-no zone. I really, really think it's funny how they do that. Stop Scamming Man. Thank you for the super chat. At the start of Mark, when Jesus does things like get angry at request, I've wondered if this is because he's initially out of his depth, having been suddenly given so much power and responsibility.
Well, again, this depends whether the stuff that's happening at the beginning of Mark is real, like it actually happened, like that. So that kind of question already presupposes that what's happening at the beginning of Mark is a true reflection of events, in which case, you know, Jesus isn't quite ready for being who he's supposed to be, type thing. So it depends what your starting point is. I mean, my guess is that almost all of the Gospels is mythological overlay, but then I don't know. I'm happy to accept that certain events or sayings Jesus might have actually said. So if I do believe that Jesus is historical, then as a cult leader, why did he have such a following that when he died, they were so invested that they had this cognitive dissonance and invented this whole new narrative? So he must have had something that is attracting people to him. So he must have had some pretty cool things that he was saying. And this is why we get these, why the sayings are so important in the construction of the Gospels. And you have these, this saying and these lists of sayings. So I think I would not be averse to accepting that there might have been a lot of the gospel sayings were actually from Jesus.
Interesting. Thank you for the super chat, man.
So I mean, when it comes to Joseph of Arimathea, you also have to go back to Isaiah 53, I think it is, which says his grave was assigned with wicked men. So he's right next to criminals, yet he was with a rich man in his death because he had done no violence. So this is what supposedly I would say the gospel authors used to cherry pick and then throw in Joseph of Arimathea, because when you look at all the accounts of Joseph of Arimathea side by side, there are some interesting kind of embellishments that go on or differences, and some interesting uses of words, like he is a rich man or a prominent member. So prominent can mean rich, like it's the same word. It looks like, why would you include these details about Joseph of Arimathea unless there's some kind of theology going on here, and you're looking to map out Isaiah 53 onto this account of Jesus's death. So I would advise reading those Joseph of Arimathea accounts side by side and looking at the differences as they go on. And he becomes more and more embellishment, and indeed when you start going to non-canonical gospels, it becomes even more embellished. Joseph of Arimathea becomes this kind of almost mythic person, ends up going to Glastonbury in England and whatnot.
Yeah, you talk about that in your book.
But
for those who have your book, page 145, if you get the book, page 145, Mark 15, Matthew 27, Luke 23, John 19, you get to see how each story is using Joseph of Arimathea differently. There are overlaps, don't get me wrong, but there are differences. And also that, like you said, prominent, right? He's rich. And this goes back to our friend Stop Scamming Man when he talked about the rich thing. I think it was him and another guy that were in the chat earlier talking about this. He was with a rich man in his death because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. This is Isaiah 53, verse 9, which is clearly going into, here's this guy, he's dying. He's with a rich man in his death. Here we have, we're going to make sure that happens.
And Joseph, he starts off being a pious Sanhedrin member and ends up being a secret follower of Jesus. So, there's this kind of embellishment that happens. There's a little a quote I want to read, if I may. Please. It says, he starts off being merely a pious Sanhedrin member before eventually becoming a secret follower of Jesus. However, there is an oddity in that Mark explicitly states Jesus is a council member, and Luke is the only other gospel author to recount this claim. Neither Matthew or John deem this an important fact to include. So, or are they correcting Mark's original assertion? So why is it that he's a Sanhedrin member in two, but he's not a Sanhedrin member in two of the others? Richard Carrier thinks that I think that all the understanding that he's a pious Jew, and actually he's not doing this. He's not taking the body down because he's a secret Jesus follower, but he's doing it because he's literally, as Mark says, a pious Sanhedrin member. Now, what you have to do here is understand the Jewish laws. Jewish laws says if you die by sunset, even if you're crucified, you have to be taken down and buried, because otherwise you're breaking Jewish law. So if you're a pious Sanhedrin member and you're walking past, or you know that Jesus has died, you're like, he's got to come down now, because if he stays up overnight and he's already dead, then we are breaking Jewish laws. So as a pious Jew, I'm taking him down and burying him somewhere temporarily before he gets buried in a criminal's graveyard, if I can't access a criminal's graveyard now. So you can read Mark as him not being a follower of Jesus at all. This is just a Jew doing what a Jew should do, which is he needs to come down now. We're not breaking the law. He's coming down. We're going to bury him. And then after this Passover festival's over, we'll bury him properly, right? But when you then start looking at the Gospels that come after, he becomes a secret member of Jesus's sect. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because if you think he's a secret member of Jesus's sect, as some of the Gospels claim, then why the hell do we have absolutely no mention of his cooperation with any of Jesus's followers? So again, I'll read you. Point. Yeah. However, this interpretation would be a charitable reading of Mark, the earliest source, who says he is a respected council member who was also himself awaiting the kingdom of God. As even Raymond Brown, famous Catholic exegete, agrees, this probably just means that he was a pious Sanhedrin member who wanted to carry out the Jewish law in accordance with his Jewish beliefs. This account gets embellished, but to recounting Joseph as being someone who strongly favors Jesus and who is a secret follower of him. On the other hand, if Joseph was truly a disciple of Jesus, then it is odd that he does not work in cooperation at all with the disciples or the women who come to the tomb to anoint the body. He has no interactions with anyone at all. He simply disappears. This leads one to favor Mark's account that he was just a pious council member. Raymond Brown concurs. So Raymond Brown, again, a very famous Catholic scholar, says this is Raymond Brown saying, no canonical gospel shows cooperation between Joseph and the women followers of Jesus, who are portrayed as present at the burial, observing where Jesus was put. Lack of cooperation in burial between the two groups of Jesus' disciples is not readily intelligible, especially when haste was needed. Why did the woman not help Joseph if he was a fellow disciple, instead of planning to come back after the Sabbath when he would not be there? And so he basically concludes that that's not historically reliable. And it looks like, and this is Peter Kirby saying, Joseph has all the signs of Deus ex machina, in the Markham plot. Now, Deus Ex Machina, you see this in films and stories and narratives. Deus Ex Machina means, God out the machine, which is that it's a narrative plot to get you out of a really bad problem. So if you've got a film narrative that's going on and you're like, I've written this film, but I can't quite understand how the character gets to do this, and then 10 minutes later gets to do this. So you invent some kind of mechanism that magically sort of allows the character to go from here to there, right? Joseph of Arimathea looks like a Deus Ex Machina, which is like, how do we get Jesus, who is a criminal, to be buried in an honorable fashion so that he can resurrect and leave an empty tomb? How do we do this? Our solution is Joseph of Arimathea. And then we invent his name, Arimathea, best disciple town. Joseph of best disciple town gives him an honorable burial. And this allows us out of a tight hole, and Jesus is then resurrected in a bodily fashion. Job done. Thanks, Joseph.
Yeah, to put it simply, like, why is he only used for that one task? And here's an interesting note you brought up in your book that I thought was fascinating. John doesn't just have Joseph of Arimathea. John adds Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea into this story. That's lacking in the synoptics. They don't even mention Nicodemus. He's nobody. But in John, it has Nicodemus.
With 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes.
Right.
Myrrh and aloes, right? 100 pounds. It's just, what's he doing walking around with? Nuts, anyway. Yeah, I don't know. That must be some reason that John wanted that in there. But yeah, absolutely. It's just another example of something not mentioned in the other synoptics, in the other gospels, but mentioned in this one. What is John up to? The question is why. Yeah. So and then it goes on to like, so Joseph of Arimathea, if he really was a pious Sanhedrin, a council member who was also a secret follower of Jesus, he's a really important guy for the early church, right? This is a guy that should pop up loads more and have a really active part in the early church, but he's never heard from again. We literally never hear about Joseph of Arimathea again. He's not in Acts, nowhere else, not in Paul, nothing. So what thesis does this better support? The fact that he disappears, does it better support he was just a Deus Ex Machina literary mechanism that the gospel writers used for certain literary ends, or was he literally a Sanhedrin Christian that the gospel writers are sort of claiming?
Right. And
it better supports the skeptical thesis, because he disappears and he's never heard from again, and he should be a perfect vehicle for the early church for propagating the teachings of the early church.
And I'm willing to go so far, right? Well, you've already given enough reason to doubt this man named Joseph of Arimathea actually existed and is a real historical event here taking place where he's really burying this guy. But I'm willing to grant, and I'm not saying I think this, I'm saying I'm willing to grant, if we go all the way, that there was a guy at this time, in some sense, named this. It's potential. I'm not saying that's the case, because the name itself is the red flag. But the point is, humans exist. It's not absurd to think that. What's absurd is when you calculate everything, talk about prior probability, you calculate all of this stuff, you start to go, okay, what kind of genre are we dealing with here? Yeah. It is no longer what the collective, literal, historical Christian narrative likes to paint it out as. And then if it is this literal, you might want to read, for those Christians in the chat today, you might want to read this, because in his book, he has taken the time. If you take a literal historical approach, you will have to, there's no way to reconcile some of these problems. Some of these problems with the death of Judas, like, there's so many things you will try to harmonize. You cannot make that work. And sure, go for it. Have fun.
So I think, and it gets even worse, right? So now all the gospel writers, according to most scholars these days, all the gospel writers were writing after the fall of Jerusalem, right? So how convenient is it that you can include a council member, include a story about a council member writing at a time when you know 100% that all the records of the Sanhedrin have been destroyed? Like, Jerusalem has been sacked, it's been destroyed, large parts of it destroyed, the temple was utterly destroyed. There is absolutely no way of anyone verifying whether Joseph of Arimathea was a real and existent Sanhedrin member. You can't do it. So this gives carte blanche to the gospel writers to invent whatever they like about any Sanhedrin member they like. which is really convenient. And then what's the chance that this random Sanhedrin member also is the guy that approaches Pilate and says, "Can we take his body down?" And Pilate, who's a complete bastard, says, "Yeah, sure, go for it." In other words, you've gone to all this effort, right? So even if you believe the theory that Mark thinks he's a pious Sanhedrin member, there is no way he's going to be buried honorably. You've gone to all this issue, and we talked about the Jewish the trial issues in the last video, which is to say that never would have happened. But if it did happen, they had to break a whole bunch of rules to get this guy done, captured and then, arrested and put on trial and found guilty and all that kind of stuff, right? So you go to all this effort, and then it's all about a dishonorable death and burial. And then when someone comes up to you and says, "Oh, by the way, can I bury this guy honorably?" You go, "Yeah, sure, go for it. Yeah, that's fine." We've just gone to all this trouble getting this guy killed and whatnot, but yeah, you go and give him an honorable burial. Now, we also know Jewish law says that the criminal bodies are like sort of cursed. Okay, so you can't bury criminals next to the righteous. It's all over Jewish law. You look at the Mishnah, like X, Y, and Z. So there's no way that he would have been buried honorably. So Joseph, wouldn't have had a rock-hewn family tomb just empty and ready to go. That's really unlikely, but maybe. And then he's not going to say, "And you can bury a criminal in there." That's fine, because that defiles the tomb, right? And no one would allow that. He would have to be buried in a criminal's graveyard. There's just nowhere at. So none of this makes sense. The Sanhedrin wouldn't allow him to be. They would allow him to be taken down before sunset, but he would be put in a criminal's graveyard. Now, if you're really charitable, you could say, okay, he was buried temporarily until after in maybe one place, and then after the Passover, he was then reinterred in the criminal's graveyard because we couldn't get to the criminal's graveyard in time. But that's kind of weird. I don't know why that, but maybe hastily had to be buried somewhere. And this could explain why his followers didn't know where he was buried, because they knew he was taken off a cross, hastily buried there. After the Passover, he's then moved and buried in a criminal's necropolis. The followers come back to where they thought he's buried, and he's not there. So actually, that moved body hypothesis is quite good for explaining stuff. But essentially, Joseph of Arimathea didn't exist. You could have a pious Jew that existed and took the body down, who then gets mythologized later as Joseph of Arimathea. I can believe that. But as the facts, so supposed facts of Joseph of Arimathea, no, didn't happen.
Thank you so much. I think this has been a wonderful discussion on the topic of prophecy and Joseph of Arimathea. Arian says, "What is the source for spitting, etc., on the goat? Do you happen to know that source?"
So yes. So what you want to look at, and the Crossan quote I gave.
Mm-hmm. What page are we on?
So I'm not gonna say a particular page because I'm just going to go to the bibliography. But basically, there's a paper which I think is freely available online, so it's not behind a paywall, by Hans Moskika about the Yom Kippur. It's a fascinating paper. Read it. It's really, really, really interesting. And if you, I don't know, you can maybe I'll put it in the comments section or whatever. But Hans Moskika, 2018, Jesus as Goat of the Day of Atonement in Recent Synoptic Gospels Research. And that's from the Currents in Biblical Research Journal, 2018, volume 17. But that should be, if you just look for that online, you should be able to find that, because I found that. And it's a really, really, really interesting paper, and it goes through all the different theories, because there's some theories saying that Jesus was, of which goat does Jesus represent? Is he the scapegoat, or is he the one that's sacrificed? And I know it looks obvious that he's going to be the one that dies, but actually the atonement is connected to one that escapes. And could it be that Jesus is the other goat or whatever? Really, really interesting paper. So have a look at it.
Thank you, Arian, for the super chat. If you guys have any questions, super chat them now before we go. I did have a question or a comment to make that I thought was interesting, incorporating Dennis McDonald's ideas.
Yes.
I just visited him. Huh?
Yeah, you just reminded me. So I'm really, really annoyed. So when I wrote this book, I had given talks on the resurrection before, and I used to talk about how Joseph of Arimathea is also a retelling of Homer's Priam from the Iliad. and I forgot to put it in the book. I just literally forgot to put it in the Joseph of Arimathea section. But if you read, anyone has Dennis MacDonald's book, Homeric Epics, and the Gospel of Mark, then from page like 154 onwards, he details how Joseph of Arimathea is definitely a retelling of Priam from the Iliad.
That's what I was going to ask. To mention is that Hector's father Priam goes to Achilles, who killed him, drags him by horse or chariot, if you will, for like 3 days, his body, and his body doesn't fall apart. That's another interesting note.
Yeah, and it's wrapped in linen and all sorts. There's loads of really interesting parallels across to Homer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And then he goes and asks for his son's body. And what does Achilles do? He gives it to him. I mean, you got to imagine, like, this is my enemy, right? Yeah. And I'm handing the body of my enemy to his dad to have a proper burial. But he also is the hero of a city, Troy, which ends up, once its hero's dead, gets destroyed. The hero of Jerusalem, Jesus, he gets destroyed. It gets destroyed. Like, this is such an interesting literary motif. And Dennis calls it eclectic mimetism. So it's not just mimetic connection or looking at the Hebrew Bible. He's saying they're using, like, both of these ideas are there. And M. David Litwa, granted, he says he doesn't think that it's mimetic, right? So he disagrees with the mimesis Dennis is doing. I don't know who's right, but I know for a fact the motif is there. And I don't think it's just accidental. I think it's intentional.
No. Yeah, because I think when you look at the Greek words that are used in Mark, I mean, there's a definite he's seen, at least according to MacDonald's analysis, and I would agree from reading it, that Mark is pulling on, because Mark would have, anyone that writes Greek would have learned Greek through learning Homer and so on and so forth. So the fact that would turn up as a motif, but also the language is probable.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're perfectly right. And I think the blaming for the destruction of Jerusalem, who's it on? Well, the people who didn't accept the hero. And who's the hero? Jesus, the Messiah. So it's eclectic. It's not a single. Most people are very comfortable going to Hebrew Bible only, or if you will, going to the Septuagint for the Greek authors of the New Testament. You know, they're real comfortable with that. But are they comfortable going outside? And this is I'm going to have to do a video series on this. I think this is the Achilles heel of Christian apologetics. What is it? I'll tell you. Christians are so comfortable, Jonathan, going to the Hebrew Bible. Like you and me, and we can go and we can confront and we can debate this. We can have these discussions and like engage, and they'll still grant, I don't care. You make it sound like it's easier to write this story after by looking at these texts. Sure, that's possible, but you're not ruling out the supernatural, that God is fulfilling the Bible scripture, right? And at the end of the day, cognitive dissonance is so powerful, there's no convincing them this. So what do? Well, if you can show them that it's not only using the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, God's word, but you can show that it's using pagan literature, Greek pagan polytheistic literature with Hector and Achilles and all these gods, and you can see that, what's that going to do to the stronghold of Christian apologetics that takes this, it's God's spiritual word and this and that, but it goes from this other literature that is not inspired by God, and the authors are inspired by this literature and by these stories. So are we going to start opening up the door now and start saying, okay, you know what? Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey is inspired by God. No, they're not willing to do that.
If my foundation of Greek knowledge and literature is built on a certain bunch of core texts, right? And I could talk about this now. So I've read like 10 fiction books, and I've read them really, really well. I know them inside out. Lord of the Rings, this, that, whatever. You can make up whatever you like, right? They're the 10 ways I've accessed learning English, and they're the 10 stories I know amazingly, right? So if I was to then create a new religious narrative, right? So I followed this guy, and then they died, and then I created this narrative to represent his life. Then you would expect me to pull on motifs from literature I know inside out, right? From stories I know inside out. And so the way I write this in a language that maybe wasn't my first language, so I've learned Greek, or I've learned English in this case, and I'm writing the story of this cult leader in a new narrative for that person. Is it likely that I'm going to be pulling on language and ideas and motifs from the books that I've learned English through? Yeah.
I think it's even more than that, though. It's not just that he's pulling language because he's learned language from the Greek, which comes from these
Yeah.
narratives.
The
Narrative itself has
yes.
it like even the whole, and we'll get into this more as you guys see more with me and Dennis, and more as your book comes, as we go through your book. I'm sure we'll bump into some of this stuff, and especially the birth narrative. There's a whole bunch we can get into. The baptism. I mean, the idea that Dennis talks about the dove that comes down and it's the Holy Spirit and says, "This is my son." And next thing you know, Jesus is empowered. He goes into the town and they go, "We know his mother and his father and his brothers and his sisters," or whatever, like we know his family. What got into this guy? Jesus, like what is up with this guy? Well, Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, starts to doubt that he is Odysseus' son. So he wanders off while the suitors that are in his father's house. Why do you make my father's house a den of thieves? Anyway, they're in his father's house. I'm kind of giving you a narrative here. He's walking off, and Athena, the goddess, flies down. The Greek says flies down. A bird flies, right? Flies down and literally bolsters up his confidence and says, "You are your father's son, Telemachus. You are Odysseus's son." He goes back and he faces the suitors and lets them know. And they're like, "What the heck got into Telemachus?" I mean, when you do that, are you going to go and say that's historical and Odysseus? Are you going to go, this is historical and Odysseus existed and Telemachus existed and Penelope and they were in this town and all? Like, no, they won't do that because they start with, I have my warm and fuzzy. I believe in this. I know because I used to do this. Intermediary Fossil, thank you so much for the super chat, my friend. I appreciate it. But it goes on and on, dude. Yeah. It just goes on and on.
So broadly speaking, that's Prophecy and Joseph Arimathea, and a bit of Yom Kippur as well. The Yom Kippur thing is super, super important. But yeah, all these sources that the gospel writers are actually using as a framework upon which to build the Jesus narrative, I think, as you point out there with Homer, is fascinating and completely what we'd expect. And yeah, so there you go. I think what I advise viewers to do is to most certainly go and read the supposed prophecies themselves as a really good, because I was trying to remind myself, because I wrote this obviously some time ago, and as I've told you, I've got primary progressive multiple sclerosis, so my short-term memory isn't as good as it could be and used to be, and yeah, and I struggle to find ideas and words sometimes, so I had to remind myself of all this before we do these videos. And here's a great bit of advice for viewers out there. If you want to see a really good analysis of the Psalms, of Isaiah, of the so-called prophecies, there's a YouTube channel called The Bible Skeptic TBS, and he goes in. So he's done a whole load of videos on just Psalm 22, going literally each video will be on one of the verses, but it's brilliant. Absolutely, really watchable, really, really good, high quality content. The Bible Skeptic, really good for looking at the prophecies of the so-called prophecies of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, or at least they don't actually really prophesy the resurrection and indeed the death. So they're kind of bizarre, the so-called prophecies. But we talked about that.
My public, just so you know, on page 149 of his book here, the resurrection, that's down in the description. Jonathan M.S. Pierce, you can't miss the question mark right here. And yeah, it's on page 149, but it's he has Kirby 2001 and Carrier 2000B. And I'm sure if I went to the back, we could probably find that.
Are you talking about reversal of expectations? So
yes.
Dennis McDonald speaks a lot about that. Carrier speaks a lot about it. Yeah, Kirby. Yeah, there's or just literally read the Gospels. Like when you read them, so the source for the motif is the Gospels. Sources are the Gospels. So you read them, you can't get away from the fact that there's a reversal of expectation going on. You can't get away from the fact that the disciples, the people that know and love Jesus the most, are the ones who end up running away and not doing what you'd expect them to do. 3 times denied. Where were they at Jesus' death and resurrection? Nowhere to be found. Who was there? A prostitute and another bunch of random Marys and Salome, and then Joseph of Arimathea, Simon of Cyrene. What is there? There's obvious reversal of expectation going on,
right?
But certainly, as you say, Carrier and MacDonald and others.
In your bibliography for everybody, you said that source is in a review of the Homeric epics and the Gospel of Mark, the secular web, and it's an infidels.org library thing.
Yeah.
So
again, that's Carrier going and adding to what he's read in this, and reviewing MacDonald's, because MacDonald is the one that talks a lot about reversal of expectation, but then Carrier then adds to that, says it fleshes it out even more.
Well, thank you so much. Go get the dang book. I don't know what we're waiting on. We're going through the series. Right now, we're at page 150. Well, we're starting at 157, right? Yeah. And honorable death and burial practices exhumed. We're going to be picking up where that is in the book, and we'll probably knock out a chapter or two. Yeah. Maybe a couple. I don't know.
That's quite a big chapter, because actually the death and burial, there's loads of evidence. There's loads of sources to pull on about what we'd expect a criminal's death and burial. The worst criminal, so Jesus is killed for the worst crime, so he should get the worst treatment. So what would we expect as far as how he would be killed and how he would be buried? And does that jive with the accounts that the Gospels give? No, not at all. Okay, so so that's what we'll look at next time.
Yeah, Appy, you are under a delusion if we are under the judgment of God. Thank you.
Which God? Just out of interest.
Yeah, of course.
Which God?
Of course.
Because he's under the delusion because he's not following Allah. Praise be.
Right. Or whoever else it may be.
Yeah.
We were just talking about the Olympian gods, so who knows? Seriously. Go to Amazon. This is what it looks like. It's paperback, ebook, however you want to follow along. Have fun doing it. I'm enjoying this book series. I am going to be getting into the nativity next. So if you wanted to go ahead and grab that, you can. We're going to be going into that one because that's the birth. If we can pick that one apart, that'll be fun, Jonathan. I really look forward to that.
Yeah, and I'm presently, as I've said before, writing a book on the Exodus, which is the final piece of that trilogy of pillars that support Christianity. So yeah, I
look forward to it. Also, your blog is down in the description, and we have the Patreon. I have with Dennis McDonald and Richard Carrier. I did 72 recordings. I was there for 5-6 days actually recording in California. You guys can get there. I mean, look, the Byzantine Church Salt. These are with Dennis McDonald, for example. This one's Dennis McDonald, Odysseus and Jesus cleansing the Father's house. What my Father's house is a den of thieves. Of course, there's Islam material. I've been interviewing a lot of different people lately. And if you guys want to go help out, you can. Dr. Price asked questions actually to Dennis. It was I think he sent me 5 to 10 questions. I can't remember. We got a lot of them recorded. Why do you trust Papias? He has a cartoonish picture of Judas, if you will, his death. And why do you trust him? All of these things are here, and you're helping me continue doing what I'm doing. So I obviously appreciate everybody can hit load more and do all that. Appreciate it. Till next time. Let's do this again. What do you say?
Oh man, this is good, Derek. I do appreciate you as a human being. You are divine. So thank you.
Well, I didn't want. This was the mark and secret. It wasn't time that you would reveal that to the public.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Awkward.
Just keep me as son of man right now, and we'll reveal.
Okay, you're a messiah. To me, you're a messiah, and maybe in 200-300 years we can work you up to being a god.
It could only take 20 years. May not even take that long. In fact, some of the scholars I talk to, it can happen within a few years. So We'll talk about it. We'll figure out how to mythologize me once.
We'll work out your narrative from now. Yeah.
But don't worry, I'm going to make sure you're there with me. You'll be seated either on the right or left side of me, hopefully not at crucifixion.
Awesome. I like to be bribed into belief. That's brilliant.
Yeah. I love you guys. Never forget, we are MythVision.